Hey everybody, it's Deanna Kosaraju with Global Tech Women. Welcome back to Voices 2015. This is version 3.0 of the annual conference for women in tech around the world, held on International Women's Day every year. So we are wrapping up the end of day 2, believe it or not. I'm not sure what time zone you're in, but we've been on since 7 o'clock last night, so that's 15 hours. So we've had a lot of great talks. The previous talk to this one was Katie Dickinson talking about mentoring. It was an awesome conversation. If you missed that one, I would seriously go back and check out the recordings. So a couple of things, if you're new to Spreecast, if you've been on a while, I'm sorry, I'm going to repeat some things. The chat window over on the right-hand side is where you can ask questions. You can introduce yourself, and this is an opportunity for you to network with other speakers. And Carolyn is waving. That's very nice. So that's where you can ask questions. If you're just a visitor and you're not logged into Spreecast, you cannot use the chat window. So I encourage everyone, although it looks like everyone so far is logged in, but anybody who comes in as a visitor will not be able to use the chat. Secondly, we have a PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to put up in a moment. And so it's going to come up on its own window, so you can drag and drop it anywhere on the screen you'd like, and so that you can watch Carolyn, you can watch the PowerPoint, and you can chat with us. So I hope that you will do that. And also keep in mind that you need to advance the slide yourself. So Carolyn's going to let us know what slide number she's on, and then we need to follow along with her by advancing the slides, and you'll see little arrows going back and forth. So that's how you advance them. So I think I've covered everything. This is going to be a fun talk, The Language of Leadership with Carolyn Simard. Carolyn and I have known each other a while now. We started together at the Anita Borg Institute, and we were there a number of years together, and I've watched her become this amazing expert and authority in the world of women in technology. So I love hearing her speak. And with that, I will launch her PowerPoint presentation. So we can drag and drop it anywhere on the screen you'd like. And I am going to hand it over to her. Carolyn?
Thank you so much, Deanna. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here and to be joining the third iteration of Voices. When Deanna started Voices and she said, I'm going to do a global virtual conference and it's going to run night and day, I said, you are crazy, in the best possible way. And it's been so amazing to see this global conversation really come to life year after year. So I feel very fortunate to be a part of it. What I'm going to talk about today is some of our research around implicit bias and how it interferes women's advancement to leadership positions. And then we're going to talk about some concrete tools that women and the people who advocate for women can use to not only see bias, but then block it. So our focus is on seeing and blocking bias. I'm now moving to slide 2. You know, when you work on women in technology, and I remember this when I used to work with Deanna at the Anita Borg Institute, we would hear things like, oh, we need to be more like medicine, right? They have 50% women engaging and graduating from the medical field. And then I went to work at a school of medicine, and I said that to my leader there, and she laughed, because the reality is they still have only 19% women full professors and a clear underrepresentation of women in leadership positions. And the reality is, in the US, and unfortunately around most of the world, women are consistently underrepresented in positions of leadership. Even if women have been earning more degrees than men since 1983 in the US, this has not translated into a commensurate representation of women advancing to leadership positions. In other words, waiting this out will not work. Why are we so stuck with this representation of women in leadership? Only 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. This has been stuck for over 4 years. And the reality is, when you look at the representation, you can almost predict that it's always going to be around 17%, right? So if you don't know what the representation of women at the top in a specific industry is, you can almost say, oh, it must be around 17%. That seems to be the ceiling that we are stuck at. Women are now at 18% of congressional officers. And Sheryl Sandberg made this joke at a talk I attended that when 18% was attained, the headline in the newspapers was that women take over Congress, right? 18% does not a takeover make. So we have a long way to go in all fields. What we see is that we have tackled all the more obvious things that we needed to pay attention to. So things like overt discrimination and harassment in more mature companies have been addressed. There are laws protecting women. We've added maternity leave for a lot of companies. But what we are stuck with, what we're left with, is the invisible glue that keeps culture stuck. And that invisible glue is unconscious bias. Now I'm moving to slide 3. Unconscious bias is a cognitive function. We cannot help but do it. What we do through bias is we make errors in judgment, and we think we are rational decision makers, but the reality is we quickly put people into buckets and categories to help us make fast decisions, and we are not aware of it, and we end up having unconscious bias. So unconscious bias is inevitable. We all do it. We all have unconscious bias. Women are just as likely to have unconscious bias towards other women than men are to have unconscious bias towards other women. So it is not an us versus them dynamic. We cannot help it. The problem is we can't spend our time policing ourselves all the time to try to eradicate bias, right? So there's this, I don't know if some of you have read the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. He uses this example in the book that when he was taking the implicit association test towards his implicit associations of African Americans, even though he is part African American and he was so trying to not express bias, he could not help it, right? So these cognitive functions we have in our brains, and they're very consistent, and it's really hard to overcome them, which doesn't mean we shouldn't try. When we talk about bias, a lot of people tell us, I don't like that word, right? We've even had some companies ask us, can you come and do unconscious bias training, but not use the word bias, which actually would be very difficult to do. So people think about unconscious bias and they think it's sexism, discrimination, harassment, men are being bad. And what we say is bias is simply an error in decision making. That's all it is. So this is a low blame, high responsibility message, right? This is, sorry, I'm on slide 4 now. So where does bias come from? I am now on slide 5. Bias comes from stereotypes. Stereotypes are the content of bias. Stereotypes are essentially generalized beliefs that we're not even aware of about a particular group or class of people. These stereotypes, I'm on slide 6, these stereotypes function as cognitive shortcuts. So if I have a lot of information coming at me and have to make a quick snap judgment decision, I'm more likely to revert to stereotypes to make this decision, right? So the stereotypes that I have implicitly in my head that I'm not even aware of lead me to make very snap judgments and decisions. Slide 7. These are some of the stereotypes that we see very pervasively about technologists. The image of computer science and technology in general, especially in the US, is very white, very male-dominated. And feel free to chat some of the stereotypes you see in your countries around technology. I would love to hear from you on what you see are the stereotypes. But essentially, the stereotype of the technologist is a man that's kind of geeky and nerdy, so doesn't have great social skills, likes specific things like Star Trek, is fiercely independent, right, because not a lot of social skills, and is really, really obsessive about work, And the one at the bottom right is an emerging stereotype, which is kind of a new stereotype, which is the stereotype of the programmer, which is not good news that this stereotype is coming up, because essentially it's reinforcing a very masculine stereotype. But in addition, it's a masculine stereotype that objectifies women, right? So it's also not a great evolution of this stereotype of the technologist. If you can believe it, the hiring practices of the 1950s for companies, you actually could see that the hiring practices were recommending that that you look for these kinds of people, right? So they essentially were looking for beards, sandals, and other signs of rugged individualism in the hiring practices. So a lot of the mechanisms have been reinforcing the stereotype, right? So a lot of people are significantly more likely to hire a young white man for a technology task than they are of hiring a woman. So men are perceived as more competent at science and technology. Slide 8. So how do we block bias? Knowing that this is a cognitive function, that it is something that is in our head, right? And that we can't police ourselves all the time. And here's a quote from Megan Smith, who's our Chief Technology Officer of the United States of America and is herself defying stereotypes. She says, recognize that we didn't create this. So these are psychosocial dynamics that exist everywhere, but we can fix it. And we have a collective responsibility to fix it. What research shows is if you do unconscious bias education and all you do is go in and say, hey, we're all biased, it's okay, right? We all do it. If you leave the message there, you've raised awareness, but you've actually made it okay for people to bias. So we need to send an extremely strong message, collective responsibility to see bias and then block bias when we see it. Really work together, both men and women, to eradicate bias from our workplaces as much as we can. Slide 10. So this is essentially a debugging process. We can actually diagnose it in our workplaces, in how we hire people, how we promote people, how we evaluate their competence, how we interact with other people in team meetings. And so we can debug that and we can block it, but it takes constant monitoring and attention. Here's a great example that you may have heard of. This study is a great example of how it's possible to do this. The study by Golden and Rouse in the year 2000 demonstrated that you can significantly block bias by doing simple solutions to help mitigate the risk of bias occurring in the first place. So in the 1970s and 80s, women were about 5% of orchestra musicians, right? And a lot of people were kind of grappling around, how do we get more women into our orchestra? A lot of people said, well, you know, it's just that they're not as good. I'm sorry, we're auditioning, I'm listening to the music, and I just hire the best musician. That's just the way it is. But they started working with social scientists, and some people said, maybe there's something else going on. So what they did is and now I'm on slide 12, sorry. What they did is they added a screen so that the gender of the person auditioning would not be visible to the judges evaluating the music. And they also had to put carpeting on the floor because the sound of clicking heels was enough to trigger the association of gender and was enough to essentially make the screen insufficient. So, but once they did that, the screen and the carpet, so that they really couldn't know whether it was a man or a woman auditioning, the odds of a woman making it to the next round of the auditions increased by a full 50%. So a tremendous effect on the ability of blocking bias there. And now women constitute 40% of orchestra musicians, right? So we went from 5% to 40%. with this very simple practice, which has then been implemented across the world. There are very few orchestras that still refuse to conduct their auditions like that. And let's just say they're not doing well in terms of the representation of women. So in most workplaces, we can't put people behind the screen when we hire them. So we're going to have to be a little more creative in workplaces, although there's some very interesting startups right now who are essentially proposing the equivalent of blind auditions to hire technologists. So slide 13. What stereotypes do in how we resort to bias is stereotypes affect the standard we use to evaluate the performance of individuals, right? So as you can see in the orchestra example, when we were judging women to a higher bar than we were judging men, so when people saw it was a woman, they were not evaluating her the same way they were evaluating the musicians that were men and were more likely to pick the men. So they were essentially holding women to a higher standard. And this is really important when we talk about the effect of bias in the workplace. A lot of women feel as they advance through their career that they have to prove themselves over and over and over again. And that's because of unconscious bias. We hold women to a higher bar and a higher standard. We're much more lenient towards the performance of men. Some people have told me the day we will have gender equality will be the day where we can have an average woman in a leadership position, just like we have a lot of average men in leadership, right? Often women have to be exceptional to make it to the top because they've had to prove themselves over and over again, and they have been held to a higher bar. Slide 14. I'm going to talk about how this affects hiring situation and how easy it is to trigger unconscious bias. This is a study that was done in the context of psychology professors. So psychology professors usually think that they are very rational people and very rational decision makers, right? So this is an audit resume study. Essentially what they did is they sent resumes to psychology professors across the US, and on half of the resumes, they put a man's name, Brian Miller, and on the other half of the resumes, they put a woman's name, Karen Miller. The exact same resume, word for word, except for the name at the top. And then they asked the psychology professors, would you hire this candidate for a tenure track position in your department? And the results were shocking. 79% of those who had received Brian's resume said yes, we would hire him in our department, and only 49% of those who received Karen's resume said yes, right? So essentially, Brian was twice as likely almost of being hired than Karen. But what was especially interesting, and now I'm on the slide 15, is that when they asked why will you not hire this person, women were subject to 4 times the extra scrutiny than men were. So things like, I would need to see evidence that she had gotten these grants and publications on her own, or, well, it would be impossible to make such a judgment without her teaching evaluations. Now, teaching evaluations is a really valid criteria if you're hiring someone for a professor position, right? You probably do want somebody who can teach. What is not okay is the fact that only the women were being singled out for their teaching evaluations, right? So one of the things that Stanford does in its hiring committees is to have an advocate on each hiring committee that asks the question of, are we holding everyone to the same standard? So if somebody asks for, well, what about her teaching evaluations? That person will say, wait a minute, are teaching evaluations a key criteria? Because if it is, we need to revisit all the other candidates for which we didn't look at teaching evaluations, right? So women often experience additional scrutiny on their performance, and that tends to hold them to a higher bar. Slide 16. Not only are women held to a higher standard because of implicit bias, but stereotypes also affect the criteria we use to evaluate the performance of individuals. So if we do not very, very clear evaluation criteria, bias steps in. Slide 17. This is the famous police chief study, which you may have heard of. Now, a police chief is a very stereotypically male profession, right? When you think of a stereotype of a police chief, you usually imagine a man in that position. And so in this experiment, what they did is they had two resumes, one resume with more education and one resume with more experience. And then they asked the group, which resume is more, which criteria is more important? Is it more education, more experience? Which resume would you choose? And everyone said more education, right? So there was a higher probability of people picking more education. Education is more important than experience for this job. In the next condition, slide 18, they added names to the resumes again. And so now the resume with more education was a man, Brian Miller, and the resume with more experience was a woman. And they said, okay, which candidate would you pick? So now if everyone's being consistent, we already said more education was the highest, the most important criteria. And then people said, yes, I pick Brian because he has more education. Right? In the next condition, they flipped it. So essentially now the resume with more education was Karen's resume. And they asked again, which resume would you pick? And they still picked Brian. And when they were asked, why did you pick Brian? People said, well, because he has more experience. So in this way, gender bias shifts the criteria we use to evaluate people. We're more likely to shift the criteria midstream to find a justification to kind of make us feel better about going with our gut decision of who we think is going to be best in the role. So what's really, really important in hiring practices is applying very consistent criteria, agreeing on the most criteria ahead of time, so we minimize the likelihood of bias occurring this way. Slide 20. How do you see the unseen? This is a famous optical illusion where you can see the face of a young woman and the face of an old woman. And it could take a little bit of time to figure out the old and the young face. For me, I had a hard time seeing the young face. But what neuroscientists show is that once you see the illusion, you cannot unsee it, right? And so once you have processed it, you know exactly what you're looking for, your brain remembers, and you can't unsee it. And this is what we're trying to do at the Clayman Institute, is to provide concrete tools for people to be able to see bias in their everyday workplaces at the micro interaction level, and then give them tools to block it. One of the best tools to see how bias manifests itself in workplaces is language. Language is a reflection of our culture, of our beliefs, and a reflection of how much we resort to stereotypes. The language we use to describe men and women's accomplishments and leadership is typically very different. So here you have two different columns. One has more communal language, and I'm on slide 22. I keep forgetting to make the point. One is more communal language, right? It's the language of we. This person's a team player, friendly, committed, a good relationship manager. And the other one in description B is what we call more agentic language. It's the language of I, taking charge, influencing others, taking risks, independent, leader, innovator, risk taker, right? The issue is that most people have both of these traits, and in fact, both of these traits are really necessary for leadership. However, our stereotype of leadership is much more in the agentic bucket, and it also overlaps with the stereotypes we have about men. So one study of letters of recommendation demonstrated that women had 30% more words of the communal category in their letters of recommendation, and were significantly less likely to be hired. Because the problem is we dichotomize these two things, and we think if somebody is communal, they can't be agentic, right? Or if they're agentic, they can't be communal. But the reality is most people have both of these traits, and in fact, you need both to be a great leader. Now I'm on slide 23. In one of the research projects we are running, we're analyzing the performance reviews of women and men technologists and looking for the balance of communal language versus agentic language. And so far, we are seeing that men have more agentic language in their reviews, although they still have communal. So it's a balance, right? When you write a performance review or you write an introduction for yourself, you really need to pay attention to language and have this balance. And let me give you an example of how this plays out. These are the words you can go back to on slide 24 to craft your own introduction. So slide 25 is an email that was written about the performance of one of my colleagues. And this was actually written by a very, very strong advocate of hers. And we are the Institute for Gender Research, so we do know about unconscious bias. This email essentially was sent in recognition of her accomplishments. It was a major accomplishment, seminal accomplishment for the Institute, written by somebody who really, really wants her to be recognized. But if you look at the language and you kind of strip it to its essence, that's on slide 26, you see that she's being described in very kind of communal terms. She's tirelessly dedicated. She has good spirits. She has a gentle touch, right? So a comment about her personality. She's caring and she's coordinating all these big personalities. Now, you could say that, yeah, this is a really nice email. The problem is this does not position her as the leader of the initiative that she did lead. It makes her sound like she was helping or supporting. And what happened after this email was sent is that most people were not congratulating Lori on the accomplishment. Most people were congratulating her boss. And because of gender stereotypes, we are much more likely to describe women's accomplishments using this kind of language. And women themselves are more likely to describe themselves this way. And so after this happened, Lori, found the research on the use of communal and agentic language, had a conversation with her leader, and then the leader kind of printed all of the letters of recommendations that she had done in the past to see if there was a pattern. And now what we do in our workplaces is hold each other accountable for the kind of language that we use to describe each other's accomplishments. So that's a very powerful thing to do. Slide 27. When I say that it's important to position each other's accomplishments to kind of block the propensity to have bias in the language that we use, the most powerful thing you can do is to advocate and sponsor other people and introduce them using the right language. What research shows, a lot of people tell women, okay, so if there's bias and people are not as likely to perceive you as really competent as a woman and a woman in technology and as a leader, why don't you just toot your own horn, right? Why don't you just take what's yours, claim credit for your ideas, and toot your own horn? And I'm on slide 28 now. So what researchers did is they tested the hypothesis that people tooting their own horn would be seen as more competent. So they had two conditions. This was actors playing out a script, right? So it was the same script, but just enacted really differently. In the humble condition, men and women were asked to kind of downplay their accomplishments and act very modest. In the condition of the horn tooting, both men and women were asked to upplay their contribution, right? I drove this, I did this, and really toot their own horn and claim credit. Now, the hypothesis was confirmed that those who tooted their own horn were both more likely to be seen as competent than those who didn't, right? So tooting the horn works to be perceived as more competent, right? The problem was the woman was now not liked. because a woman tooting her own horn violates the gender stereotypes of women needing to be selfless and caring and more concerned about other people's well-being than their own. So now the woman who was tooting her own horn incurred what we call a likability penalty and was not likely to get the job, because now it was like, yeah, she's really competent, but it seems like I'd have a hard time working with her. She seems difficult to work with, right? And so only the man tooting his own horn had the best outcome. So as you can see, again, we're holding women to different standards. Slide 29. This is what we call the double bind, when women who are seen as competent suffer a likability penalty, right? So a woman who is successful in a stereotypically male job is seen as less likable, less attractive, less happy, and less socially desirable. And so successful female managers are seen as more deceitful, pushy, selfish, and abrasive than successful male managers. So this is why it's really, really difficult for women in senior leadership positions, right? Because they're always experiencing that tightrope, right? If they're too soft, they're not seen as competent, they're not seen as leaders, their competence is questioned. But if they're not soft enough, or they're more assertive, then we don't like them and we think they're aggressive and pushy. What's interesting for me in this is once you understand these dynamics, you can learn to kind of navigate them. Women who are able to kind of self-monitor and kind of modulate their amount of assertiveness and amount of less assertiveness are significantly more successful in leadership position. But it really is like walking a tightrope, right? What I also think about is often people talk about women's lack of ambition, right? Oh, women are not ambitious and they don't want to advance. They keep saying, I mean, when you see that the cost of ambition and advancement is people liking you or not, that's an extremely high price to pay, right? So what we really need is to see when the likability penalty is hitting women disproportionately, and then we need to eradicate it and make sure we hold each other accountable for not enacting this penalty on women leaders. Slide 30. So a great way to avoid the likability penalty is to have other people advocate for you. And this is an action for tomorrow that you can take, and you can do this for each other. You can do this for other women in your workplace. You can form what Joan Williams of UC Hastings called a posse, and have your posse in your workplace and really help each other position yourselves in the strongest possible way and introduce each other. Because if somebody else is tooting your horn for you, you don't have the likability penalty. You're seen as more competent because somebody tooted your horn, but now you don't have the penalty because you're not the one tooting your own horn. So this quote is how Lori's same accomplishment was described in a keynote by Sheryl Sandberg at Stanford in front of 600 people. And she positioned Lori's accomplishment as, I've had the privilege and honor of working with Shelley and Lori, so she really advocated for them, said she believed strongly in leadership and never met better leaders. And then she tied it to the specific skills and expertise that the leadership of the Clayman Institute brings to the table. And this endorsement that was done in front of a very big audience and in front of the president of the university significantly elevated our position on campus and our ability to launch our Women's Leadership Center. So these well-crafted introductions have a tremendous effect in eradicating bias for women. One of the things that I do and that we all do for each other, even if you are going to a conference like this one, right, really paying attention to the language you use in your bio. If you look at your LinkedIn endorsements, how are they describing you? Is it all about how caring you are and how nice you are? Or is it really focusing on your accomplishments and some of your leadership attributes? And so these things really matter. We were talking to a woman who said, I cannot get anybody, she's an Asian woman, and she said, I can't get anyone to write a LinkedIn endorsement for me that doesn't say I'm nice, right? And the problem is being nice is fantastic, but it's not really what people are looking for when they're hiring for a leadership position. It reinforces the gender bias that, oh, women are nice and men are tough and leaders, right? So really paying close attention to how you position your accomplishments can have a significant effect. Slide 31. So we see how women's style and personality gets conflated with evaluations of their technical competence in interview situations. This is research by Koji Chavez, who's one of our graduate students here at Stanford. It's groundbreaking research on interview roundups in a tech company. So he sat in these interview roundups. And what he saw is that the evaluation of technical competence, where everybody thought they were being really objective, right? I'm a technologist, and technical competence, it's just that. It's about your technical acumen, whether you can code, that's all that matters. The reality is women's communication style was all significantly more likely to be conflated with evaluations of their technical competence. So comments like, yeah, she can code, but she can't convince me about her decisions, right? So feeling that it's not just about coding, but it really is about how assertive you are in presenting your decisions and your technology. Now, remember what we talked about, the gender bias, which is women are not socialized to communicate assertively, and when they do it, people don't like them, right? And there's also a phenomenon in interview situations called stereotype threat, where women are, especially if they're interviewing with only a group of men in a highly stressful situation, the stereotype threat triggers anxiety of confirming the stereotypes that women are not as competent or are going to be judged more harshly for their competence. And that can make women more nervous, and any minority more nervous in an interview situation. So the stereotype threat is a significant factor in hiring. And then the other one, the other quote was about this woman's asking questions. And in fact, even the interview panel in this situation had agreed that some of their new interviewing process was kind of unclear. But they picked up on that person's asking of questions as a negative, and that would mean that she would need babysitting on the job, right? So a significant penalty here interpreted as some sort of a weakness, whereas you could have said, actually, somebody asking questions is a really good sign. We want somebody who will question things. We want somebody who will get to the bottom of things to really get to the depth of expertise that they need. But because of gender bias, we interpret these things as weakness and really conflate evaluations of technical competence with evaluation of somebody's style, in which bias comes in. So one of the key things that needs to happen is to really separate style from the evaluation of technical competence. And this is something that we talk about a lot with hiring committees and different companies, to really define what style means and if it's a needed criteria, and if it is, to be very clearly articulated separate from technical competence. And then ask themselves, would we say the same thing about a man exhibiting this style? What do we mean by style? What exactly are behaviors we need for this person to be successful in this job? Slide 33. So separating technical competence from style, and also really understanding what is meant by cultural fit. Often cultural fit is used as kind of a catch-all criteria that really opens the door to bias, because we think of cultural fit as, is this somebody I want to hang out with, right? And is this somebody I want to hang out with really triggers bias, because we like to hang out with people who are just like us. So cultural fit, if it is a key criteria, and a lot of companies believe that it's a key criteria, it needs to be really well articulated. Slide 34. everybody needs to notice when higher or different standards are used to evaluate the performance of certain individuals. So both in hiring situations, in performance reviews, or even when you're up for your own performance review, or people are going to evaluate you on certain things, understanding what the criteria are and whether you're being held to a higher standard or whether some people are being held to a different or higher standard is a great way to block bias. Again, not in a combative way, but saying, I want to understand how this criteria is being applied and how it's being applied across candidates so I can learn. And then it really forces people to examine their criteria and examine their positions. And it turns out that if you're asked to justify the criteria and the decision to other people, it slows down and it helps you define your criteria, and then it minimizes the probability of bias occurring. So it's a very effective, tool to block bias. Slide 35. So this is a toolkit separating style from technical competence and then noticing when higher or different standards are being applied to different people and insisting on consistent application of standards. Like I said earlier, if somebody says, yeah, she seems like she's no fun, which we've actually heard being raised, she's no fun. Okay, is fun one of the criteria? Because if it is, we need to evaluate everyone on fun, right? If this is in the job description, then evaluate people consistently on it. Slide 36. So this happens in performance evaluations as well. This is from research, like I said, that we're conducting on analyzing the language used in talking about men's and women's accomplishments in performance evaluations. This is a case where both candidates are being evaluated in their more collaborative leadership characteristic, right? So one is described as super positive, can-do attitude, people enjoy working with this person. And the other one is positioned as this person has created a forum which enables greater visibility and collaboration across the many complex initiatives in flight. And by now you can probably guess which one is the review of the woman and which one is the review of the man. And this is director plus level in a technical organization, right? So these are really, really senior leaders. Slide 37, you can see that the woman is described in terms of her personality and people like working with her, whereas the man, for the same kind of collaboration attributes, is being described in terms of what business outcomes were achieved based on his ability to collaborate. So making sure that evaluations of women are grounded in the business results is extremely important for them to be seen as the leaders they are. Slide 38. This means that we need to separate personality from feedback and focus on accomplishments. Women are much more likely to be commented on in terms of their personality and much less likely to be positioned in terms of accomplishments. The problem is this language really is kind of the tagline that positions somebody for a promotion, right? So focusing on the business outcomes and accomplishments, technology accomplishments is extremely important. What I really want everyone to do after today is to craft an introduction statement for yourself that somebody else could use to introduce you, focusing on your expertise, your accomplishments, your outcomes, and balancing and equalizing the language of leadership. It's really difficult to do. It is not, especially for yourself. We were at a session at one company where a leader just could not write an introduction statement for herself that didn't make her sound like only helping other people. And finally, a male leader rewrote it and really positioned her, and it was this, and then read it in front of the entire room, and it was for her transformational to hear her accomplishments described in this way, and kind of realizing how much business impact she was having, and that's the way her competence should have been positioned the whole time. Slide 39. So we've talked about separating style from technical competence, noticing when higher or different standards are being used, and insisting on consistent application of standards and criteria, and then separating personality from feedback and focus on accomplishments. Slide 40. As I said before, women are much more likely to be criticized for their style, their communication style, and their personality. So often what happens in performance reviews and in hiring situations, women get feedback that they're either not assertive enough or too assertive, right? So this is an example of a criticism of personality that came from the Fortune. It was a study done by a linguist who essentially crowdsourced performance reviews from about 200 people from over 20 tech companies, I believe, and reported her findings with Fortune. And these are the kind of comments that women were getting. You could come across as abrasive. I know you don't mean to, but you need to pay attention to your tone, right? So this is a criticism of personality and communication style. It's a clear manifestation potentially of the likability penalty, but it doesn't really articulate if there is feedback to be had for communication style. It really needs to be grounded again in business results and outcomes, right? If somebody's communication is impeding them from achieving specific results, that's what should be talked about, as opposed to you need to pay attention to your tone. Slide 41, from that study, what that study showed that was reported in Fortune this year is that women were significantly more likely to get negative feedback about their personalities and communication styles. So they were not getting constructive feedback, whereas men, the vast majority were getting constructive feedback. So feedback that were grounded in results that they could actually act on, as opposed to a criticism of style and personality. So this was kind of a great eye-opener of how bias creeps into the language we use to describe accomplishments. Slide 42. I'm not going to have you do this on your own, but what you really, really want to do is to write an introduction or advocacy statement for another woman or for yourself. And if you have friends who are great at marketing, I have found that they are brilliant at helping craft somebody's positioning statement and introduction. You want to pay attention to the language of competence and position your technical accomplishments, focus on accomplishments and expertise and results, and then balance the amount of agentic language and communal language so that you can be seen for all your attributes, all your leadership attributes, and minimize the amount of unconscious bias in the perception. One of the studies that I also want to mention how powerful this is. So there was a professor who published his research where he was noticing that his female teaching assistant was getting lower teaching evaluations than his male teaching assistant. And he thought, there's something off here because, you know, I know she's great, she's really competent. I don't see how her teaching is not as good as the guy TA, right? And so what he did is in one condition, in one group, he introduced her as, this is Lisa, she'll be your TA. That's it. In the other group, he vouched for her competence. He said, this is Lisa. She's going to be your teaching assistant. She has published several papers in the area of research that we're going to be focusing on in this course. She is a fantastic teacher and leader, and she will deliver an amazing experience for you. In the condition where he positioned her competence, her teaching evaluations were significantly higher than in the condition where he did not position her as such, right? So essentially what he did by positioning her for her leadership and her expertise is reduce the harsher criticism that women are subject to because of unconscious bias. So I really encourage all of you to go and write this advocacy statement for yourself and for other women. Introduce each other in this way. Pay attention to the LinkedIn endorsements on your LinkedIn page. It's a very powerful tool. So now on slide 43, you kind of have the whole recap of this. What I do hope is that everybody after today will take just one action. Either it is to block bias when you see it in your workplace and in your environment, even how it affects your kids. Write an advocacy statement for yourself and for other women. And if you want feedback on what I think about it, I'd be happy to take a look. I'm starting to have a keen eye for the right balance of language. I will be happy to take questions now. If you want to ask me a question, you can chat, I believe. So Diane says, this gives us a great perspective. Our self-evaluations are due this week at work, and I will keep language in mind. You know, it's really interesting when Diane mentions self-evaluations. Often in evaluation processes, people are asked to self-evaluate first, and then the manager evaluates the person. Actually, some companies are doing away with self-evaluations because there's such a difference in the language used, because men are significantly more likely to they're significantly more likely to be overconfident in their accomplishments, and women are significantly less likely to be confident in their own accomplishments. And so there's often a discrepancy in how people describe their results, whether they are a man or a woman. Lisa says, thank you for a great presentation. Would love to know your thoughts on how we can shift the language being used by our own managers. Yes, I think this is key. And I think one of the things you can do, first of all, there is this unconscious bias education that we give to a lot of men. And we actually have them write the advocacy statement and practice changing language and evaluations. So that can be a great tool. But also, if you see a woman in a situation not being positioned right, you can really help position each other in the right way and elevate each other's expertise. That's something that you can do. I've heard of women watching for each other in meetings, describing each other's accomplishments, positioning it, getting key allies to position the right language. Suggestions on how to make this change in our own organizations. I just heard yesterday from a colleague that she has been told she needs to be less direct in order to be promoted. This is a question from Pat. This is extremely typical that women suffer the likability penalty and are told that criticized for their communication style, right? So it's kind of you're either not assertive enough or you're too assertive. And often people are given the feedback, the opposite direction, that they lack executive presence, right? And to me, feedback about executive presence, it's a clear manifestation of implicit bias often. And Diana says the word gravitas is also used. Yeah, and I mean, we like to joke sometimes that that's feedback for you're not a man, right? And so how then, I think what managers need to do, right? If communication is in the way of results, that's how they need to really articulate it, right? Sometimes people do need feedback on how they communicate, but only if it's preventing them from achieving the results, right? And so how to make this change in the organizations, I think organizations need to spread awareness around the fact that bias creeps into evaluations, that we hold women to harsher standards for their communication style, and really try to equalize the playing field. So if directness is a criteria for not being promoted, would this manager make the same evaluation of a man, right? So we need to apply very consistent criteria, and it does take some discipline to do that. Any other questions? What we like to think about is giving tools that can be really implemented by individual people in their organizations. Paying attention to the language you use and how you describe other people's accomplishments is something that everybody can do, right? You don't need to overhaul the entire performance management process to do that. But it does take a significant amount of education to increase awareness, and then a collective responsibility for action. That's really important. Thank you so much, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody, for attending this session. And the URL that you see up there above will be available in 30 minutes as a recording. So you can send it to your friends and colleagues. Also, I put in the chat box there the link to the slide deck. And I'm hoping that you will download it and read it again. It's very useful, great tips there for how we can raise all women up to levels of leadership and how we can all contribute towards increasing the numbers of women in leadership positions. Some great advice. So thank you, Carolyn, so much as usual. You're amazing.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you for the great opportunity, and thank you, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this in a virtual platform. I'm used to the face-to-face, and it's actually great for me to get this experience as well.
Great, great. Well, I hope you all participate in our next session, which is Women's Empowerment, the first ever global survey to hear voice, value, and vision of today's young women. Jen In from 4Girls Global Leadership is doing some amazing work trying to empower women and girls around the world. So I hope that you will join our next session. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Thanks, Carolyn.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.